Story number 1. Intake 19. I arrived at the Safe House facility on a Tuesday afternoon in late September to conduct standard 72-hour witness intake for a federal protection case. The subject was a financial crimes informant, 41 years old, an accountant named Michael Torres who had agreed to testify against his former employer in exchange for relocation assistance. The facility was a converted ranch house 23 miles outside of Kalispell, staffed by rotating personnel from the Marshals Service. I had conducted 11 prior intakes at various locations without incident. Torres was cooperative during initial processing. He signed the required documentation, surrendered his personal electronics, and completed the medical screening questionnaire without objection. His vitals were normal. He answered my questions about dietary restrictions and medication needs clearly and without hesitation. When I showed him to the assigned bedroom on the second floor, he stood in the doorway for several seconds, then informed me he would prefer to sleep in the common area. I asked if there was a specific concern. He said the room was fine, but he slept better on couches. I noted this in the intake log and provided bedding. The first night passed without incident. I occupied the staff quarters on the first floor, a small room adjacent to the kitchen with a direct sightline to the common area when the door was open. I am a light sleeper by training and habit. At 3:17 in the morning on the second night, I woke to the sound of creaking floorboards in the hallway outside my door. I rose, opened the door, and found Torres standing motionless in the narrow corridor facing the wall, approximately 4 feet from my threshold. He was barefoot and wearing the same clothes he had worn during intake. His eyes were open. I identified myself and asked if he needed assistance. He did not respond. I repeated the question at a higher volume. No response. I approached and placed a hand on his shoulder to guide him back to the common area. His skin was cold enough that I retrieved the medical kit and took his temperature with the digital thermometer. It registered 94.2 degrees. I wrapped him in a blanket and sat with him until his temperature returned to normal range, which took approximately 30 minutes. When he became fully responsive, he had no memory of leaving the couch or entering the hallway. I documented the incident and contacted my supervisor via the secure line at 0600. I was instructed to continue standard protocol and log any further behavioral observations. Torres ate breakfast without issue and spent the day reading materials from the facility's limited library. He did not mention the previous night. I checked the locks on all entry points twice that day. At 3:17 the following morning, I woke again and immediately went to the hallway. Torres was standing in the same position, facing the same section of wall. This time I noticed muddy footprints on the floor leading from the direction of the front entrance to where he stood. The prints were consistent with bare feet. I checked the front door. It was locked from the inside with the deadbolt engaged, as I had secured it myself before retiring. I checked the back door and all ground floor windows, all locked, all undisturbed. I guided Torres back to the common area. His temperature was 93.8 degrees. I did not ask him questions while he was in this state. I cleaned the muddy footprints with paper towels and placed them in a plastic bag, which I stored in the medical kit. The mud was dark and smelled of wet leaves. When Torres regained normal responsiveness 20 minutes later, I asked if he had gone outside. He said no. I asked if he had any history of sleepwalking. He said he did not. I violated containment protocol at 0700 by accessing the exterior security camera system without authorization. The system maintains 72 hours of rolling footage across 4 cameras covering the perimeter. I reviewed the footage from 0200 to 0400. At 2:53, the front door opened and Torres exited the building. He walked directly toward the tree line at the eastern edge of the property, moving at a steady pace, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the camera's range. At 3:12, he reappeared from the trees and walked back to the front door, entering the building and closing the door behind him. I then reviewed the interior camera footage for the same period. It showed Torres lying motionless on the couch in the common area from 0200 until I entered the hallway at 3:17. He did not rise. He did not move. At 3:13, while the exterior footage showed him entering the building, the interior footage showed him lying in the same position. I contacted my supervisor at 0730. I described what I had observed and what the footage showed. There was a pause of approximately 8 seconds. My supervisor instructed me to maintain position, avoid direct confrontation with the subject, and await an extraction team that would arrive within 6 hours. I was told to disable the security system and remove the storage drive, which I did. Torres remained calm throughout the day. He asked me if something was wrong. I told him there had been a scheduling change and he would be transferred to a different facility for the remainder of his intake period. He accepted this without question. I did not sleep that night. At 3:17, I was seated in the kitchen with a clear view of the common area. Torres stood from the couch, walked to the front door, and placed his right hand flat against the wood beside the lock. He did not attempt to open it. He stood there for 4 minutes. I observed him through the doorway while simultaneously watching the exterior camera feed on my phone before I remembered I had been instructed to disable the system. I had not complied with that instruction. The exterior feed showed a figure matching Torres's description and clothing, walking back from the tree line and approaching the front door. The figure stopped 3 feet from the door at the same moment. Torres removed his hand from the interior side. The figure outside remained stationary. Torres returned to the couch and lay down. The figure outside turned and walked back toward the trees, disappearing from frame at 3:22. The extraction team arrived at 06:15. Torres was transferred to a medical evaluation facility under psychiatric hold. I surrendered the security drive and my written logs. I was reassigned to administrative duties pending a formal review. 3 weeks later, I was informed the review had been completed and classified as closed without findings. I was returned to field rotation in November. I have not been assigned to the Montana facilities since. The case file for Michael Torres was transferred to a jurisdiction I do not have clearance to access. My supervisor retired 5 months after the incident. I do not know where Torres was relocated or whether his testimony was ever used in court. Story number 2. The Surveyor. I was assigned to conduct a boundary survey and eminent domain assessment on a disputed property in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia in late September of 2023. The work was routine, part of the preliminary phase for a proposed natural gas pipeline expansion. The parcel in question sat at the intersection of 3 county lines, which had complicated the title history, but my role was limited to physical assessment and documentation of existing boundaries. The property owner was a woman in her late 70s or early 80s, living alone in a house that predated the county records I'd been provided. She was present each day I worked, watching from her porch or standing at the edge of the clearing. She did not speak to me on the first day. On the second day, when I placed a marker along the western boundary, she walked over and said the land did not want to be measured. I acknowledged her statement and continued working. She repeated it twice more that afternoon, once while I was setting up the transit and again as I was packing my equipment. Her tone was not hostile but insistent, as though she were relaying information I should already know. On the third day, I began experiencing consistent angular errors with my transit. Every sighting along the western boundary registered a deviation of exactly 7 degrees from the expected bearing. I recalibrated the instrument twice, confirmed the setup with a handheld GPS unit, and even returned to a benchmark I had established on the first day. The benchmark had not moved. The error persisted only along the western line. I contacted my supervisor and requested a replacement transit, which was delivered that evening. The following morning, I repeated the measurements with the new equipment. The error was identical. I documented the discrepancy in my field notes and proceeded with the survey of the northern and eastern boundaries, both of which presented no issues. I returned to the western line in the afternoon and placed 4 additional markers at measured intervals, flagging each with high visibility tape and recording their coordinates. The property owner was not visible that day, though I saw her curtains move several times. On the morning of the 4th day, I discovered that all 6 markers along the western boundary had moved. They had not been removed or disturbed in the usual sense. Each marker was still upright, still flagged, but their positions had shifted inward, away from the original boundary line. The displacement was uniform, approximately 30 feet, and when I plotted their new locations, they formed a precise arc. I checked my notes from the previous day. The coordinates I had recorded did not match the current positions. I used the GPS unit to verify. The markers were where I was looking at them, not where I had placed them. I walked the western boundary on foot, looking for signs of tampering or subsurface instability. The ground was undisturbed. There were no footprints other than my own, no tool marks, no depressions or upheaval. I considered the possibility of equipment failure, but the markers themselves were physical objects. They had moved. I returned to the house to speak with the property owner. She did not answer when I knocked. I waited several minutes, then walked around to the side of the house where I could see into the kitchen window. She was seated at the table, her head resting on her arms. I called out. She did not move. I contacted county emergency services and waited on the porch until they arrived. The EMTs entered the house and pronounced her dead at the scene. They indicated it appeared to be natural causes, likely during the night. I provided a brief statement and left when they told me I could. I did not return to the site that day. The following morning, I went back to complete the documentation required for my report. I opened my field book and found that my notes from the previous 3 days were no longer legible. The ink had faded uniformly to a pale gray across every page where I had recorded measurements, coordinates, or observations related to the western boundary. The notes from the northern and eastern surveys were unaffected. I checked the pens I'd used. They functioned normally. I attempted to resurvey the western boundary, but my transit continued to register the 7-degree error, and I could not establish reliable data. I returned to the office and informed my supervisor that I was unable to complete the assessment due to equipment malfunction and data loss. He asked if I had encountered any subsurface anomalies. I told him I suspected unstable ground conditions along the western edge of the property, though I had no direct evidence. He instructed me to include that assessment in my report and recommended the pipeline route be altered to avoid the parcel. I was not authorized to make that recommendation, but I included it nonetheless. The report was filed on October 6th. On October 10th, I received a notification that the property had been withdrawn from eminent domain proceedings. No explanation was provided. Approximately 2 weeks later, I was informed that the parcel had been reclassified under a conservation easement. I was not briefed on the mechanism or the agency responsible. On November 2nd, a representative from the regional office arrived at my location and collected my transit, GPS unit, and field book. He said the equipment was being recalled for routine maintenance and calibration. I was issued replacements the same day. The serial numbers did not match any equipment I had previously used, and no record of the collected instruments appeared in the inventory system I had access to. I was reassigned to municipal boundary projects within city limits for the remainder of 2023 and into the following spring. I received no further communication regarding the West Virginia assessment. The pipeline project proceeded along an altered route that added approximately 4 miles to the planned corridor. I was not involved in the revised survey work. The case file was closed in March of 2024 and archived under a designation I was not provided access to. Story number 3. Quarantine Bay. I arrived at the regional hospital in Coeur d'Alene at 11:30 in the morning to assess a quarantine breach involving a patient who had been isolated following suspected exposure to an unidentified biological agent. The facility administrator met me in the main lobby and escorted me through 2 security checkpoints without speaking. Her badge indicated she had been with the hospital for 16 years. She did not make eye contact. The attending physician briefed me in the hallway outside Ward C, explaining that the patient, a forestry worker in his 40s, had been stable for 3 days before staff reported hearing him speaking in the room despite being alone. The physician was precise in his language and referred to his notes frequently. He said the patient had been cooperative during intake, had shown no signs of delirium, and had been compliant with all isolation procedures until the morning of the 3rd day. At that point, a nurse performing a routine vitals check reported hearing a conversation. When she opened the door, the patient was alone. I reviewed the observation logs and noted that multiple nurses had documented the voice as conversational in tone, with pauses suggesting responses, though no second person was ever visible on camera. The logs included timestamps and initials. 3 separate staff members had made entries. The descriptions were consistent. One nurse wrote that the voice sounded like it was coming from beside the bed. Another noted that the patient appeared to be listening carefully before responding. The video archive showed the patient sitting upright, occasionally nodding, his lips moving in a way that matched speech patterns. The room was empty except for standard medical furniture. When I entered the isolation room wearing standard protective equipment, the patient was seated upright in bed, facing the corner, and continued speaking in a low, steady rhythm without acknowledging my presence. I closed the door behind me and stood near the foot of the bed. His voice was calm and measured. He was describing something about a trail marker and a distance measured in paces. He paused for several seconds, then nodded slightly and continued. I waited for him to finish before introducing myself. He did not turn around. I attempted to redirect his attention using established psychiatric protocols, but he turned to me only once and said that someone else had already taken his statement. His expression was polite but distant. He gestured toward the chair beside the bed as if someone was sitting there. I asked him to describe who he was speaking with. He looked at me for a moment, then turned back toward the corner and resumed speaking in the same measured tone. I repeated the question. He did not respond. The video feed from inside the room showed only the patient and myself, but the audio recording captured a second voice answering my questions in a calm, administrative tone before I could speak. I did not hear this voice while I was in the room. I reviewed the recording later with the hospital's security coordinator. The second voice was male, steady, and without accent. It provided responses to questions I had not yet asked aloud. The coordinator played the segment 3 times. On the recording, the second voice could be heard clearly stating my name and employee identification number before I had introduced myself. The timestamp on the recording matched the period I was standing at the foot of the bed. I contacted my supervisor to request immediate extraction and reclassification of the case, but during the call, the patient stood, walked to the window, and placed his palm flat against the glass, leaving a handprint that remained visible even after his hand moved away. I was still on the phone when this occurred. The patient pressed his hand to the window for approximately 5 seconds, then stepped back and returned to the bed. The handprint remained on the glass. It was not a smudge or condensation mark. It appeared to be burned into the surface. I ended the call and approached the window. The print was warm to the touch. The patient sat quietly and did not look at me. The hospital was instructed to transfer the patient to a federal facility under infectious disease protocols, and I was reassigned to administrative review pending evaluation of the audio evidence. The transfer was arranged within 2 hours. I was not informed of the destination. The patient was sedated and transported by a team I did not recognize. They wore unmarked uniforms and did not speak to hospital staff. I was instructed to surrender all notes and recordings to a federal courier who arrived 16 minutes after the patient departed. I complied without question. My written report omitted the handprint and the second voice, listing the incident as a case of isolation-induced psychosis with recommended psychiatric follow-up. The report was filed under standard medical classification and required no further investigation. I included observations regarding the patient's cooperative behavior and stable vitals. I recommended continued observation in a controlled environment. The report was submitted to my supervisor and countersigned the same day. No additional questions were asked. The patient was logged as transferred, though no receiving facility appears in the federal database, and the isolation ward was decommissioned 4 weeks later. I submitted a records request through official channels and received a response indicating no transfer matching the patient's identification number or date. The hospital administrator confirmed that Ward C was closed for renovations and subsequently converted to storage. I was told the decision had been made prior to the incident. The window with the handprint was replaced during the renovation. I did not ask what happened to the original glass. The case file was archived and marked for restricted access. I have not been contacted for follow-up.